Hello and welcome to week 6 in the psychology of personality. And in the progression of our understanding here, we've been exploring some of the history of psychology, and we're moving into this particular point in history. But before we do that fully, I want you to understand that all of the psychodynamic stuff that we have been talking about up until now was happening at the same time as the behavioral learning theory stuff that we're going to still talk about in the future. And the reason why they're out of sequence in this course in terms of a timeline, for whatever reason the author selected that. However, it's important to recognize that this week's chapter marks a turning point away from not only the theories of psychodynamic, but also learning theory. You see, up until now, in the historical perspective of understandings of personality, the reigning ideas were behaviorism and psychoanalytic. So those are either, it was, were the result, our behavior is the result of selected reinforcers and punishments that we get from the behavioral model, or it's the id, ego, and superego in this realm of the unconscious working itself out and bubbling to the surface, resulting in our personality. A set of psychologists were looking at this and saying, wait a minute, all of this, the psychodynamic and the behavioral, are fairly deterministic. Where is the person's personal will, their choices, all of this? People could basically go into some of the counseling and helping professions in those areas and I'm the subject of the id, ego, superego conflicts, or I am the subject of my parents, what they reinforced and not. And the taking on of personal responsibility really was absent from the dialogue. So along come two incredibly famous researchers, one of whom was contemporary when I first started. He's now passed away, and that was Carl Rogers, but also Abraham Maslow, probably one of the more famous of the psychologists, and they defined the humanist movement, and that was to move the psychology lens a bit away, or to provide another lens within the field of psychology that captures the human person's ability to make choices. Okay, so you have Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow coming onto the scene. I'm going to set up my little slideshow here for you a little bit. Now, first Maslow, an amazing individual, brilliant individual, and really one of my favorite theorists to read about. He was lighthearted and fun, and just didn't take things too seriously, yet he was an incredible thinker and an incredible researcher, and very, very, very much loved people. And he came up with probably the most famous of all the psychological theories, famous beyond the world of psychology, and that's, of course, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's portrayed in the course book, and it's what he's most famous for. However, that's not what we're going to focus on. You'll get that in you'll get the hierarchy of needs in almost every other psych class. So we're going to take a look at, when we look at our first discussion, actually we look at our only discussion, we're going to look at Maslow's emphasis on human values. What is important priorities? It kind of relates to his hierarchy of needs. There are things that were more high priority than the lower needs, and he really focused that. And what I'm going to be asking you to do is to get your head wrapped around Maslow's perspective of human values, and then look at the notion of political rhetoric and religious dogma, those two areas by which values are communicated, and then evaluate those. Are they human values? Are they reflecting human values? Do sometimes, maybe in the critical thinking discussion, do sometimes the promotion of human values actually also at the same time support individual ambition? So let's say someone is running for for a political office, and they latch onto a particular human value and they use that to catapult themselves forward. And we could also look at either in a manipulative way or in a, you have to join religions for them, it's kind of a voluntary thing as an adult. But religions also, in my sociology class, we're talking about groups and social control. And religions often have mechanisms where if you decide, and I'm going to approach this as an adult, if you decide to quote unquote join a group of people who have faith and latch yourself onto the values that they represent willfully, the church has mechanisms and a responsibility to reach out to you directly if you start acting in a way that's contrary to those beliefs. Essentially, hey, you joined our group, you said that you agree with these values and whatnot. What are you doing? You're going out and doing these things, and that's really not in line with what our church teaches and stuff like that. Of course, we can see that in its negative sense, but it's also a way in which individuals can learn and grow. They can challenge themselves to those particular values and whatnot and try and live up to them as a way of self-improvement. And so looking at those through the lens of Maslow's values, getting that. In the quiz, we look at Rogers' concept of the unique experiential field. Now, the unique experiential field to which he is referring is a limit to our ability to empathize and take someone's perspective. He essentially says that is never fully possible. We can never fully understand somebody's reality, somebody else's reality, only our own, even if we've been through very similar circumstances. So part of his work was really uplifting the value of a individual's personal experiences. So let's say they were a victim of abuse. Their particular perspective on that is unique. And as a therapist, of which Rogers was, he was a clinician and was working with individuals with these kinds of histories. He held in very high regard their particular perspective on those situations, and basically didn't feel that there was a whole lot of room for me to apply my understanding of those particular situations, because even if I'd been there, done that, I wasn't there and did it the way they did it. So it was very, very uplifting to the personal experience and a kind of an honoring of that experience, and really locate in his particular theory. He really focused on what was called the integration of self and how it relates to this. And to switch to that slide, this is the picture of the client coming into counseling. Essentially, the battleground was incongruent self. The goal was congruent self. This is both as a process of therapy and as a process of human development. Now, if someone, let's say, came in to see Carl Rogers or someone who practiced Rogerian therapy and they had a particular history, the analysis would be, well, here's your perspective of the world, here's your, what we might say is your true self. And then there's you at the same time, you also have an ideal self, and at the same time, you also have a social self. That's what you portray to the world. And so how can we change either perspectives that I have that are real of myself to be more in line with my ideal self? How can I lower my expectations if they're out of line from the ideal self? Maybe that ideal is from that abusive partner. I'm never good enough, so therefore my ideal self is unattainable. So how do I modify my ideal self, and how do I live authentically? How do I portray my real self to the real world, and maybe open up the opportunity for the development of real and authentic relationships? Bringing that in, when you bring that real self, ideal self, and social self into more alignment, it looks a little bit more like the chart on the right. You know, my real self, my self-image, and my ideal self are aligned. They've all been changed, okay, through the process of development or counseling, but they're more aligned, and therefore the amount of conflict that the person is experiencing and anxiety gets reduced. So we're going to be talking about that in the quiz. Now, finally, I want you to start looking at the final project in this class, and that is at the end of the course book. There's a description of what I'm calling is an auto-ethnography. I pulled this from my anthropology class. An ethnography is an enriched study of a particular ethnic example. And in this particular point, it's going to be your ethnicity and how it contributed to making you the person that you are today. And so it's because this class is both a view of psychology, but it's also the social influences, you know, the cultural influences. Right from the beginning, we've always been talking about culture as influences. We can look at all the psychological theories, but they're all embedded in our personal cultural experience as well. So I want you to start looking at that assignment. It's a fairly involved assignment, and you're free to start working on it at any time. You're free to reach out and ask questions about it at any time. We're about a little bit more than a third of the way through the course, so now is a good time to start working on that particular project. So if there's any questions, please post them in the discussion board under class questions. Best way to do that, I will see them, I will respond to them, but other people will also see those answers too, and we can help each other do the best that we can on that particular project. It's an enjoyable project of self-discovery, actually. So it's not all research. A lot of it is an introspection, really going back to the roots of psychology, looking at myself as a way of understanding psychology. And so I hope that you can see the project as a really nice opportunity for self-development as well. So I look forward to these discussions as we start talking about the humanists as a sort of response to the overbearing and very predominant psychoanalytic and behavioral components. We'll get into the behavioral stuff a little bit later, but it's a great transition that happens within these theories. So I will see you on the discussion board this week.